Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we're going to be discussing Tsar Simeon the Great. Now today's video is actually going to be the first part of a two-part video on Tsar Simeon the Great. In this video we will be discussing how Simeon continues and completes his father's nation-building project, the project that was started under the reign of Boris I, who started this process of creating the Bulgarian national identity at the end of the 9th century. In the next video, we'll be discussing Tsar Simeon's military campaigns and his ambitious pursuit to become the Roman emperor. So that's what we'll be discussing next time. But again, in this video, we're going to be discussing more of the cultural developments within the First Bulgarian Empire under the reign of Simeon the Great. Now, as far as the historical timeline is concerned, we're basically going to be picking up from where we left off several videos ago when we discussed the Christianization of the Macedonian Slavs and the Bulgarian identity within medieval Macedonia. If you haven't seen those videos, I'll post a link to those down below in the description, so you might want to check those out prior to watching this video just to get caught up on the historical timeline if you prefer. But basically, like I said, we're picking up at the end of the 9th century. What occurs at the end of the 9th century in Bulgaria, in Macedonia, is that Boris I, who is the ruler of Bulgaria at this time period, resigns from the throne and decides to retire to a monastery to live out the rest of his days as a monk. He chooses his son Vladimir to take over his position as a ruler of the Bulgarian state. However, as we discussed previously, Vladimir basically tries to undo the reforms, the cultural, linguistic, religious reforms of his father, Boris I, by siding with the old Bulgar nobility, with the boyars, and trying to repaganize Bulgaria. Basically, Vladimir and the boyars are not in favor of the Christianization of Bulgaria, nor of its new Slavic character. So as soon as Vladimir becomes the leader of the Bulgarian state, he tries to undo the reforms of his father, Boris. Now, as one could expect, Boris is not too pleased with the actions of his son, and therefore Boris comes out of monastic retirement, if you will, and deposes Vladimir. Basically, Boris enters the city of Pliska, the capital of Bulgaria at that time, with a military force that is still loyal to him. Vladimir is arrested, he is blinded, and thrown into a dungeon for the remainder of his life. So that is Vladimir's punishment for trying to undo the reforms of Boris, his father. Now, Boris is now left having to find a new heir to his throne, and he actually looks towards his son Simeon, who is also a monk. He is in the monastic life, and Boris is forced to pull Simeon out of the monastery and places him at the head of the state as the new Bulgarian ruler. Now, who is Simeon? Well, Simeon is a younger son of Boris, and Simeon has spent a large portion of his life up to this point in Constantinople, receiving a Roman education. When he was in Constantinople, probably from the age of 12, 13, 14, probably in his early teens, he was sent to Constantinople, and there he studied at the Imperial University in Constantinople, as well as at its Slavonic college. So Simeon would have been fluent in both Greek and Old Church Slavonic, and that probably made him the most educated Bulgarian in history up until that point. He was so familiar with the Greek language, Greek culture, philosophy, way of life, and so forth, that he was often referred to as the half-Greek or the hemi-Argus. So he is, again, a very well-educated, probably the most well-educated Bulgarian at this time. And the reason why he's in Constantinople receiving this education is because his father, Boris, wishes to set him up to be the archbishop of the new Bulgarian church. Now, hopefully one day he might even be a patriarch if the Bulgarian church is elevated to that status, but that is the purpose of Simeon's education, is to be the head of the Bulgarian church. However, as we just stated, that plan will be derailed as Simeon is forced out of the religious life and into the secular life due to Bulgaria's need for a new ruler. Now, as I alluded to previously, one of Simeon's greatest accomplishments is the completion of his father's nation-building reforms. Basically, what Boris was attempting to do was build a new nation, a new Bulgarian nation, out of the various tribes that lived under Bulgar rule. And what Boris is doing here, as we discussed, like I said in previous videos, is he is unifying all the various people groups within the Bulgarian realm. He is unifying them around the Slavic language and the Christian faith. He is setting up literary schools to spread the language. Those literary schools are located in Preslav and in Ohrid. He has also created the Bulgarian church, the first national church in history. So these are some of the reforms that Vladimir was trying to undermine in order to keep the Bulgarian state pagan and Bulgar. And I will be quoting in this regard from Stephen Runciman in his excellent book, A History of the First Bulgarian Empire. Boris calculated that the enforcement of Slavonic as the one national language of Bulgaria would submerge forever the conscious exclusiveness and superiority of the old Bulgars. The children of the Huns were to lose their identity. Bulgarian was to mean now Slav and Bulgar alike, any subject of the Bulgarian monarch, who was the sublime Khan no longer, but the Knyaz, the Slavonic prince. With the change in the language, it was probable that the organization of the Bulgar church was completed to fit the new state of things. Sometime about now, the country was divided up between 7 metropolitans under the Archbishop of Bulgaria. The metropolitans of Dristra, Philippopolis, Sardica, Provadia, Morava, Bregalnica, and Ohrid. Runciman goes on to state, quote, "In connection with these ecclesiastical reforms, another great change was made. Joseph, the Archbishop of Bulgaria, and his archiepiscopal seat was not at Pliska, but at Preslav. The capital was being moved. Pliska, the Hunnish capital, with its memories of the great heathen Khans, was no longer suitable. The Christian prince should dwell at Preslav, close to the monastery of the Panteleimon and the Christian college of Naum." So, as we just read, the Bulgarian capital will be moved from Pliska to Preslav, a new capital for a new people. Now, what Simeon attempts to do in Preslav is to replicate the glory of Constantinople within his own realm. And here I will quote again from Stephen Runciman. Quote, "Simeon had seen in Constantinople the aureole of splendor that surrounded the emperor and emphasized the sanctity as the viceroy of God. He understood its value for the cause of autocracy. In his new capital of Preslav, Great Preslav, the renowned, he attempted to magnify himself likewise. The city began to blossom with churches and with the palaces built by the courtiers who followed the prince's lead. But the royal palace was the center of it all. The glory radiated from Simeon. The effect was the more overwhelming in that it was so suddenly created. Nothing had ever been seen like it in Bulgaria before. John the Exarch, in his dedicatory chapter of the Shestodniev, attempted to describe the sensations of a visitor from the provinces, how he would be overcome by the sight of all the great buildings, with their marbles and their frescoes, the sight of heaven adorned with stars, sun, and moon, earth with the grass and trees, and the fishes of the sea of all sort come upon him, and his mind is lost. He comes back despising his own home, and wishes to build himself as high as heaven. In the midst of it all sat Simeon, in a garment studded with pearls, a chain of metals around his neck, and bracelets on his wrist, girt with a purple girdle, and a golden sword by his side. John's eloquence breaks down under the strain of describing it all. He can only complain that he is guilty of understatement. His visitor departs to exclaim to his friends that, quote, "It is impossible to tell you of the splendor, beauty, and orderliness, and each of you must see it for yourselves." Now, in addition to Stephen Runciman, we will also be quoting our old friend John Fine in regard to the creation of this new capital at Preslav. Fine writes, quote, "Simeon encouraged monasticism. At least 8 monasteries existed in and around his new capital of Prislov. That city grew under Simeon's supervision. Its palace was renovated, new churches were built, and its commercial quarter had active shops in which artisans specialized in ceramics, stone, glass, wood, and metals, particularly in gold and silver. Exquisite examples of these craftsmen's skills are now displayed in the National Historical Museum in Sofia. Bulgarian tilework in the Prislov style was particularly famous. Beautiful examples of these tiles have survived. Because Bulgarian tiles achieved a higher quality than the Byzantine, they were imported by Byzantium and by Russia. Aside from Prislov's physical beauty and glory, the reason why Prislov is such an important city in this time period is that it becomes the center of the translation of literary works by Bulgarian scholars. Basically, various types of literary works are being translated from Greek into Slavonic. And all these literary works that are being translated into the Cyrillic alphabet, not the old Glagolitic alphabet. For a while, it appears that both Cyrillic and Glagolitic were being used simultaneously within the Bulgarian realm. Cyrillic more in the east, as it was developed, we believe, in the Prislov literary school. So Cyrillic kind of develops in Prislov and is more common in the east, while the Glagolitic is still being used in the west, particularly in Macedonia, out of the Ohrid literary school, at least at first. Now, eventually, as the Cyrillic alphabet becomes more dominant and begins spreading throughout the Bulgarian realm and into Macedonia, it will be the dominant alphabet and it will replace the Glagolitic. Now, some of the Greeks happen to object to the use of the Cyrillic alphabet, as they feel that the Bulgarians should be using the Greek alphabet, even though the language would be Slavonic. The Greek alphabet should be used and it shouldn't be changed to a new alphabet. However, there is pushback from the Bulgarian side, basically defending the use of the Cyrillic alphabet, and one of the people who defends its use will be the Bulgarian monk Hrabar. And I will quote now from Hrabar's defense of the Cyrillic alphabet. Some say, "Why should there be Slavic books? They have not been created by God or by the angels, and they are not original like the Jewish, Latin, or Greek books which go back to the beginning and are accepted by God. Still others think that God himself created the letters. They do not know, wretched souls, what they are talking about, and they think that God has ordered books to be written in 3 languages because it is written in the gospel that, quote, and there was a board with writing in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, end quote. Since the Slavic language was not there, the Slavic books are not God-given. What can we say to that, and what can we reply to such fools? Let us answer as we have been taught from the holy texts, that all comes in its turn from God and from no one else. God did not create the Hebrew or the Greek language, but the Syrian, which Adam spoke, and what was spoken from Adam to the deluge, and from the deluge to God's creation of the tongues at the Tower of Babel, or of the confusion of tongues, as it is written. Before then, the Greeks had no alphabet of their own, but wrote their speeches with Phoenician letters, and so it was for many years. Then came the Palamedes, who started with Alpha and Beta and devised only 16 letters for the Greeks. Cadmos of Miletus added 3 letters. Thus many men over the years barely managed to assemble 38 letters. Then, after many years, by God's will, 70 men were found to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. The Slavic books, however, were translated, and the letters were invented by Cyril alone in a few years, whereas 7 invented over many years the Greek letters, and 70 made the translation. For this reason, the Slavic letters are holier and more respectable because they were devised by a saint, whereas the Greek letters were devised by pagan Greeks. If you ask the Greek bookmen, who invented your letters and translated your books and when, few of them know. If you ask, however, the Slavic bookmen, who invented your letters and translated your books, they all know, and will reply, St. Constantine the philosopher. He and his brother Methodius invented our letters and translated our books, because there were still men alive who saw them. And if you ask them at what time they know, and they will say that it was in the time of the Byzantine Emperor Michael and the Bulgarian Prince Boris. There are other answers which we will give elsewhere, for there is no time now. Thus, brothers, God has enlightened the Slavs. It should also be noted that we're not just seeing a translation of religious books from Greek into Slavonic during this time period at Preslav, but also legal and historical texts. Beyond that, we also see romances and dramas being translated from Greek into Slavonic. And there's also the creation of original works in the Slavonic language during this time period. So what we see here in Preslav under the reign of Simeon is an explosion of literacy. This is truly Bulgaria's golden age. Aside from Preslav, there is another important city within the Bulgarian Empire, this one located on its wild western frontier, and that is the city of Ohrid. The person who will be in charge in Ohrid will be Saint Clement Ohridsky, who would be sent there originally by Boris in order to convert the Slavic pagan tribes to Christianity and spread literacy in that portion of the Bulgarian realm. And Clement will continue this work under the reign of Tsar Simeon. Now, to give you an idea of what Clement's doing at that time, I'll be quoting from a source entitled A History of Christianity in the Balkans, a study in the spread of Byzantine culture among the Slavs, written by Matthew Spinka from the Chicago Theological Seminary. Now, Spinka here, in regard to Clement, writes, quote, "It is possible that Clement's field of labor was near to his own birthplace, for he appears to have been a Byzantine Slav. The districts selected for Clement's missionary work were located in the southwest region of Macedonia and were known as Kutmichevica and Divol. To ensure full cooperation of the civil authorities of that region, Boris recalled the Bulgarian governor of the place and sent an official, probably a Slav, Dometa by name, to administer it in cooperation with Clement. In fact, the latter seems to have acted as superior to the former. Clement was granted several places of residence, 3 in the district of Divol, where under his leadership a Slavic school for the training of priests and other clerics was established, and houses at Ohrid and Glovenica. At the Divol training school, Clement hoped to train in time a sufficient number of Slavic clergy to enable Boris to displace the entire Greek hierarchy and clergy. During the 7 years of Clement's headship of the Slavic school in Divol, it is said that 3,500 pupils received their education there, and they were ordained as readers, singers, deacons, and priests, and sent to their posts to carry on Slavonic work. There, they were sent in large groups into 12 regions of the province, but extended their work even among the neighboring Serbian population. It was in this manner that the ideas and work of the great Slavic apostles of Moravia found abundant fruition in Bulgaria as well as in Serbia. Besides his preaching and teaching activities, Clement produced many translations from Greek. Later, he was appointed bishop of the dual see of Debrica and Belica, northwest of Prilep, his place at the head of the Divol school being taken by Naum, who had hitherto been presiding over the monastery of St. Panteleimon. Clement thus became the first Slavic bishop of Bulgaria. So here we see that Clement was so successful in his missionary and literary work that he would be made the bishop of the diocese of Ohrid within the Bulgarian church. Now, Clement here will be supplementing the literary projects that are being conducted at Preslav through the Ohrid Literary School, which was originally set up by Boris I, father of Simeon. And what's important to know here is that Boris and Simeon were Clement's biggest patrons. They were the ones funding Clement's work in Ohrid. And in fact, they recognize that Boris is Bulgaria's greatest scholar. In fact, Simeon refers to Clement as the new Ptolemy. Here I would like to quote from Stephen Runciman once more, this time in regard to Clement's work in Ohrid. Runciman writes, quote, "Ever since he settled in Macedonia, Clement had been busily translating. He found himself greatly handicapped by the prevalent ignorance of Greek, and the people there were very stupid. The only hope lay in copious translations, but Clement was indefatigable. He could draw on the works of his great masters, Cyril and Methodius, and he supplemented them as best he could. By the end of the century, he had made Ohrid one of the most renowned centers for the dissemination of Christianity and culture. And when he began to retire from active life, his work was amply carried on by his old fellow disciple Naum, who had come from Preslav to take on the bishopric of Ohrid. So here, although Runciman doesn't really paint a very flattering picture of the people in Macedonia by stating that they are ignorant of the Greek and very stupid, we can tell by that statement that these are not the same people in Macedonia that were there prior to the Slavic migrations. If these were the original Macedonians, if these were the indigenous people of that region, they would have been much more familiar with the Greek language and much more educated than these kind of wild Slavic tribesmen from the north who are part of this, who are now living in this part of the Bulgarian Empire in Macedonia. Now, at the end of the day, what we see here during the late 9th and into the early 10th century, during the reign of Boris and then later under the reign of his son Simeon, is the creation of a new nation, a Bulgarian nation. Again, what they are doing here is they're taking the various tribal and ethnic groups that are under the control of the Bulgarian state, and they are unifying all those peoples under a common language, under a common faith, and thereby forming a new national identity. Now, a lot of people who we call Macedonists like to discredit this entire nation-building process of the Middle Ages. Basically, they argue that no Bulgarian nation was formed during the Middle Ages. It is legitimate. It is illegitimate to discuss the formation of nations during the Middle Ages, and so forth. However, unfortunately for them, we have recognition of this nation-building process, which occurs under Boris and then later under Simeon, by the Byzantines themselves, namely by the patriarch in Constantinople, Nicholas. As we will discuss in the second video, in part 2, in regard to Simeon's life, Simeon has a very close relationship to Nicholas, and during the Bulgarian-Byzantine Wars, we will see communication, letters being written back and forth between Simeon and Nicholas. And here we have an excerpt from one of the letters written by Nicholas to Simeon. And in that letter, we can see just how Nicholas refers to Simeon, how he sees Simeon in relation to Bulgaria. And here Nicholas states, quote, "For who could have ever anticipated that Simeon, for his great wisdom, for the favor shown to him by heaven, has led the Bulgarian nation to a height of glory, who more than any man detests knavery, who honors justice, who abominates injustice, who is above sensual pleasures, who stints his belly like a hermit on the mountains, and who tastes no wine." So here, again, Nicholas refers to Simeon as the leader of the, quote, Bulgarian nation. So I don't know what more proof you need that the Byzantines saw the formation of the Bulgarian nation here under the reign of Boris and of Simeon. But, we never know. Maybe Patriarch Nicholas was wrong. Maybe he just didn't read enough YouTube and Facebook comments by Macedonians with Virginia Sun avatars to know that the Bulgarian nation was actually formed in the 19th century by the Russians. That's also a possibility. However, I think what is more likely is that the Patriarch of Constantinople witnessed firsthand how this medieval nation was created in Bulgaria. Now, one of you guys recently asked me whether I think that this history, this medieval history of Bulgaria, the history of the First Bulgarian Empire, should be taught in Macedonian schools as the history of the modern Macedonians. And my answer to that is yes, absolutely. Not only should it be, but it must be taught in Macedonia due to the fact that the current way that history is being taught there through this Macedonist lens completely distorts the history of the people. The people there have no idea what their true history is, what their medieval history is, who their ancestors were, what they fought for, and so forth, because of these historical distortions by the Macedonists. If we take Clement, for example, Clement, if you look at it from the Macedonian historiography, is presented in a complete vacuum. He is hermetically sealed. And what I mean by that is his role in history is completely decontextualized. The Macedonians have no concept of the historical context in which Clement was operating. They think he was some sort of creator of the Macedonian church. He was somehow involved in the creation of a Macedonian state in the Middle Ages, which is complete fantasy. As we see here, it's clear as day that Clement, not only is he not part of the creation of a Macedonian church, which there is no Macedonian church at this time period, or a Macedonian state, but he is central in the creation of a Bulgarian church, of a Bulgarian nation, and so forth. So this is why we need to teach this history in a completely contextual fashion, not in the decontextualized fashion which many Macedonists presented in. And the reason why they present it in a decontextualized fashion, like I said, is because that's the only way they can put forward their false narratives, is in the decontextualized fashion where there's no larger picture surrounding these figures. You will never, ever see a coherent historical narrative from a Macedonist regarding the medieval period, because they can't put one together. Because if you look at the historical narrative during this time period, it's, again, clear as day that what we have here is the formation of a Bulgarian identity, a Bulgarian church, and that Clement is central to the formation of that medieval identity. Most Macedonians have no idea who Boris is, who Simeon was. They have no idea that those two people were the main patrons of Clement, that they're the ones who created the Ohrid Literary School. They're the ones who financed the school and supported Clement there. Yes, absolutely, we need to be presenting this history as the true history of the modern Macedonians. And it's a complete tragedy that it is not, because what occurs in this Macedonist version of history is basically we're left with nothing. Huge portions of our history are deleted and removed. There are massive holes in our history. Basically what these Macedonists are doing is robbing us of the most glorious portions of our history. Some of those glorious portions we'll be discussing in the next video, where we talk about the life of Simeon and so forth. But all of that has been deleted from our history. We are robbed of that history, and therefore these historical arsonists, which is what they are, must be confronted and challenged every step of the way. Simeon's reign represents the fruition of the ideas and policies of his father, and opened the greatest epoch in Bulgarian history. The efforts of Boris to make his country an independent national and ecclesiastical unit, and to secure for it the riches of the Byzantine culture in the language of its own people, were gloriously realized by Simeon. His reign was surnamed the Golden Age of Bulgaria, and the Golden Epoch for Bulgarian literature. He himself is known to history as Simeon the Great, a title which he bears with relatively better justification than many other rulers similarly honored.